The Twilight Zone is easily the most widely known, critically acclaimed, and all-around culturally impactful thing that the great Rod Serling ever worked on. But his second most famous work might just be Night Gallery. Or maybe third most famous, depending on who you ask. He did also co-write the original Planet of the Apes movie, after all. Anyway, like The Twilight Zone, Night Gallery was an anthology TV series, but its stories generally leaned harder into horror and the macabre than its predecessor, which people tend to remember more for science fiction and fantasy stories, though Night Gallery would have several of those too. The final product unfortunately wasn't quite the spiritual successor to the Twilight Zone that Serling envisioned it to be, as he had less and less creative control as the show went on, with creative differences between him and producer Jack Laird in regards to the format and tone of the show, the powers that be meddling with his scripts time and time again, and other issues and compromises that left Serling more than a little disappointed in the end. I can't say I blame the man for taking personal issue with them marketing it as Rod Serling's Night Gallery for the name recognition, when it was, in the end, not as much his true creation as he would have liked. Even though the Night Gallery series we got in the end wasn't quite what Mr. Serling originally wanted, he still brought his A-game to it, and was every bit the classy, articulate host for all 3 seasons of this show that he was for The Twilight Zone. And overall, I think the majority of the series does hold up as a pretty damn enjoyable anthology show, with plenty of macabre, moody, mysterious, and even moving tales. You probably could call it an underrated show to a degree, but it did leave enough of a mark on pop culture that it has been lovingly referenced and parodied from time to time. The show came out in the late 60s and early 70s, and admittedly the sensibilities of some of the segments definitely feel that way at times. You will occasionally get a premise that sounds interesting or scary on paper, but the presentation winds up making the actual viewing experience kind of dull. Or sometimes you'll get awkward, comedic, 1 or 2 minute short stories that really clash with the rest of the show, and are so basic that it's clear they only exist to pad out the runtime, and or attract viewers with an extra guest star like Adam West or Cesar Romero, like one where a vampire goes to a blood bank only for the lady at the desk to realize that he's a vampire. And that's it. Hilarious. I wasn't alive in the 70s, so I admittedly will never really know, but I've gotta imagine these filler segments were pretty weak even at the time. But those are small speed bumps in a show with the writing talents of Rod Serling himself and several other great creators at the time, like Richard Matheson, Robert Bloch, and the directorial debut of none other than Steven Spielberg. There were more than enough smart, spooky, and sophisticatedly written stories to make this show well worth checking out, especially for Twilight Zone fans, and extra especially for those who love the moodier, creepier Twilight Zone stories. So today I'm going to count down my personal favorites. Opinions always vary, of course, and I'm sure my picks and the order I rank them in will differ from how many of you would do your own lists, so as always I encourage you to share your own thoughts. In celebration of this Halloween season, here are my top 13 favorite segments of Night Gallery. Number 13. Certain Shadows on the Wall. A wealthy, terminally ill woman is in her last days, and her only comfort has been her brother reading her favorite stories to her every night. Said brother and 2 other sisters have all been living here in their childhood home, awaiting the inevitable for some time. And while none of them are exactly in great spirits or very fond of each other, the brother is the one who's most open about how much disdain he has for all of them, and how ready he is for their sister to finally die, finally leave the inheritance he's been waiting so patiently for, and finally allow him to get the hell out of this house and put it behind him forever. But after the sister does die, an uncannily perfect shadow of her appears on the wall, and to everybody's amazement and fright, it seems to have no source, and can't be painted over or obscured in any way. It's as if their sister never left, an unexplainable specter still demanding the same simple pleasures she clinged to in the last days of her life, including the close company of her brother, who the other 2 sisters suspect was so eager to reap the benefits of her passing that he may have actually sped up the process. In the end, whether he really did or not, this one remains a short, sweet, classically gothic tale that closes on an entirely fitting note for all involved. Number 12. The Diary. I don't see this one on very many favorites lists, But like most of Night Gallery's best episodes, it's written by Rod Serling himself and as such feels very much like a good classic Twilight Zone episode. A gossip columnist who writes biting and humiliating exposés of celebrities is gifted a mysterious diary by an aging movie star whose reputation the columnist and her tell-all program smeared. Out of bemused curiosity, the columnist looks inside the diary and finds an entry lamenting the actress's recent suicide, written perfectly in her own handwriting, and just at that moment, to her astonishment and horror, the actress does indeed walk in front of a car just outside the building. Every day, an initially blank page of the diary becomes filled in with past tense descriptions of things that somehow or other always inevitably happen later that day. The diary mentions the phone being out, and what do you know, later she trips and breaks the phone. A prophecy that she subconsciously fulfilled herself once the idea was planted in her mind? Perhaps, and no huge deal really. But a couple days later, the diary says her boyfriend died and that it was all her fault. And soon he is indeed killed in an accident that he was only present for because he was on his way back from the business trip that she got him to cancel because she assumed something on that trip was going to be his undoing. Is the diary really supernatural in nature? Does she have actual precognitive abilities that she can't control? Is there still an entirely rational answer somewhere in her subconscious? In any case, after the latest passage ends saying that our formerly cruel columnist will be racked with guilt that she can't live with any longer, and she sees the page for the next day remaining blank, the burning question is, does that mean what it seems to mean for her immediate future? And if so, is there anything she can do to change it? Number 11. The Other Way Out. The third season of Night Gallery dropped the hour-long multi-story episode format in favor of your standard half-hour episodes. That change in and of itself is not a problem, but unfortunately many of the stories in Season 3 are also not as much to write home about as the first 2 years. This one, though, in my opinion, is one of the highlights. A man receives a blackmail letter from somebody who knows that he murdered a go-go dancer he'd been seeing behind his wife's back. In accordance to the letter's instructions, he drives out to an isolated house on the outskirts of town to meet the blackmailer, who turns out to be the woman's grandfather, played by the one and only Burl Ives. And he's surprisingly more quirky and mellow than the man expected, but also turns out to be totally prepared for him bringing a gun, and makes it clear that he is deadly serious about keeping his granddaughter's killer trapped in this house until the mysterious Sonny comes home to deal with him. Ives takes the gun's bullets away, has attack dogs in the yard to keep the man from running away, and lets him get lost deep in the labyrinthian basement of the house, all while Ives just relaxes in his chair, plays the ukulele, or is that actually a regular sized guitar? I don't know, clearly I'm not an instrument guy. And assures his guest that there's another way out he just needs to find before Sonny arrives. What is this other way out? Who is this Sonny he's waiting for? What is the real endgame in this elaborate revenge plan that Ives has set up? Well, check it out for yourselves and enjoy what is easily my personal favorite episode of Season 3. Number 10. Class of '99. This is another Rod Serling penned story, and it's one of the man's pesky cautionary tales that's great, but it's difficult to explain what's so great about it without spoiling the twist. It's only at the end when you realize what you were really watching the whole time, why it felt so bizarre and uncomfortable throughout, and appreciate what it really has to say on top of everything it was more obviously saying before that point. It's one of two Night Gallery stories that starred the great and powerful Vincent Price, this time as a professor conducting the final exam at what seems to be a normal college, at first. But before long, Price's questioning and his responses to any less than perfect answers to said questions become unsettlingly harsh, and with little to no protest from anybody. His unforgiving approach to higher education is accepted as totally reasonable at this institution, and the cold matter-of-factness of it all gives this lecture room an increasingly surreal and disturbing tone, especially as the exam moves on to behavioral science, and Price has the students conduct exercises that deal with racism, classism, and jingoism, and we see just how far educators in this society will take these exercises in order to get the quote-unquote correct answers out of the students. Not to mention what happens to those who fail. Class of '99 paints a somewhat familiar Serling-style picture of a dark dystopian future, with themes of conformity, prejudice, and authoritarianism, like with The Obsolete Man or Eye of the Beholder, but again with a great ending twist that's a wacky yet thought-provoking idea all by itself, and the nature of which provides a whole new perspective on those aforementioned themes. Number 9. The Doll. This is one of the most famous Night Gallery stories due to how memorably creepy the titular doll is on sight alone. And unlike some other horror stories with scary living dolls, the adults in this one are immediately aware of how frightening this thing is even before they have any inkling it might be capable of murder. The story starts with a wary, aging colonizer of India coming home to England and finding that the sweet, innocent niece in his charge has been gifted by mail a special doll that to her is a welcome companion, but to him is a disturbing message, a unique instrument of revenge for the atrocities he committed and so easily justified to himself during his time abroad. Like Talkie Tina before her, this doll becomes an increasingly threatening presence in the house that's harder to get rid of than you might expect, and that won't stop terrorizing this home until the man she hates is dead. Unlike Chucky after her, however, and what I really like about this killer living doll, is that we never actually see it speaking, moving on its own, or unambiguously causing any direct harm to anybody. It supposedly talks to the little girl in private. We see the violently torn up remains of another doll that it apparently didn't like, and it seems to do other sinister things throughout the story, but the audience only ever sees the doll sitting completely still, looking ominous, implying it was never really a supernatural threat at all, and the creeping idea that it was led to its victims unwittingly doing themselves in. But also, if you choose to believe it really was alive, the idea that it could wreak havoc and command so much fear while never even needing to get up and do anything, at least never in plain sight, is also pretty damn scary. As I mentioned in last year's Top 13 video, I personally could take or leave evil doll horror stories most of the time, but this is a Night Gallery fan favorite for good reason that I just can't help but love too. Number 8. They're tearing down Tim Riley's bar. This is considered by many fans to be one of the all-time best episodes, and in terms of writing, acting, and emotional impact, I'm inclined to agree. But I place it in the lower half of my personal favorites list, because whether they're altogether stronger stories or not, the episodes I placed higher just have more of what I generally come to this show to see, i.e., neat horror or sci-fi elements, spooky atmosphere, clever twist endings, etc. It stars William Wyndham as a middle-aged executive who feels that his best days are behind him, and just getting further and further behind. A feeling that leaves him listless, depressed, and often day drunk. He's a still grieving widower. There's a much younger up-and-comer who easily outshines his already declining work performance, and is clearly looking to take over his position at the company, and even Tim Riley's bar, his old hangout where some of the happiest memories of his life took place, is being demolished soon. The closest thing this story has to a traditional Night Gallery-esque supernatural hook is the way Wyndham inexplicably finds himself returning to some of those cherished memories, briefly reliving the glory days. His celebrated return from the war, when the company was just starting out and he was the go-getter who everybody respected and relied on, and the days when his wife was still alive, and her scolding him for tracking mud on the floor was the smallest price to pay just for having her in his life every day. But no matter how hard he tries to believe it's all real, no matter how much he drinks to hopefully numb the pain and keep up these comforting illusions, and no matter how much he dwells on the most gleeful and painful moments, he inevitably has to face the reality that he can never really go back. This may not be the kind of story I'm usually looking for when I sit down to watch a horror series, but it's still easily one of the overall strongest stories in the show. A sincere and emotionally meaningful tale about a man wrestling with how to go on when everything he valued in his life is gone, and the changing world around him seems to no longer value him. But it does ultimately leave you with a sense of hope and a big smile on your face at the end. Number 7. Since Aunt Ada Came to Stay. Compared to some of the other more monster-loving horror anthologies like Tales from the Dark Side, Monsters, or Creepshow, Night Gallery actually doesn't have very many simple, traditional hit the hero against a supernatural creature like a vampire, werewolf, zombie, etc., and see how they handle it stories. But this segment feels closer to that, albeit with a monster who still looks human, and that simplicity is part of the fun. A college professor and his wife are adjusting to the wife's elderly Aunt Ada moving in with them, and she particularly weirds the professor out right from the get-go. Her aversion to the carnations they grow in the yard, which she tries to pass off as a simple flower allergy, but there really seems to be more to it than that. How she seems to appear in places and suddenly disappear in the blink of an eye. How regularly and insistently she serves her special tea to the wife. How short and cryptic she is whenever questioned about any of her increasingly strange and creepy behavior. One of the professor's colleagues, who's very knowledgeable about the occult, and is played by Jonathan Harris, aka Dr. Smith from the original Lost in Space, suggested that Aunt Ada might actually be a witch who is planning to perform a special ritual that will transfer herself into the wife's body come midnight during the next full moon. The professor, as a man of science and rationality, is naturally skeptical of this idea at first, but the closer the night of the full moon gets, the less Aunt Ada even tries to hide just how right Dr. Smith was, flaunting her dark powers right in front of the professor, and taking a mischievous glee in it all, knowing his wife will never believe him if he tries to tell her that her sweet, frail aunt is a danger to anybody, let alone an actual witch. With the time of the ritual drawing nigh, and Aunt Ada continually finding ways around our hero's every attempt to keep his wife out of her reach, will he find a way to foil this body-snatching house guest's plans? Again, the premise of a skeptical man dealing with a real witch in his house threatening the one he loves is a simple, straightforward, and ultimately well-executed monster movie premise, and Aunt Ada herself is a memorably sinister entity who alone makes this story well worth watching for anyone who loves to see classically evil witches enjoying being witches, complete with hokey 70s TV effects. Number 6. The Dead Man. A researcher invites his doctor friend to see the results of a breakthrough he's recently made. He's found the perfect specimen for his experiments, a young man who, through hypnotic trances and special triggers, can physically manifest symptoms of diseases he never had, even extreme late-stage symptoms that are totally convincing to the doctor. Turns out the symptoms aren't just convincing, they're essentially real, because the researcher has figured out how to make the patient's unconscious mind genuinely believe they're real, and the patient can just as easily revert back to being in impeccable health as soon as he's taken out of the trance. This makes him the crown jewel of the researcher's life's work, and potentially the ultimate testament to the idea of mind over matter, and all the potential that could unlock for humanity. What muddies the waters, however, is the fact that the researcher's wife is having an affair with the patient, and while the husband knows about it, he puts his work and the greater good benefits of it over his personal jealousy and resentment. Or does he? The next stage of the ongoing experiment is pushing the limits and seeing if he can trigger the patient to simulate death and then trigger him out of the trance, essentially bringing him back to life. The trigger for the former part works like a charm. He is, for all intents and purposes, dead as a doornail. But the latter part doesn't work. The researcher is unable to bring his patient back no matter how many times he desperately repeats the trigger. Ironically, given his own belief in the power of mind over matter, it's suggested that his resentment may have caused him to sabotage his own experiment and kill his patient, as the doctor eventually realizes that his friend was subconsciously using the wrong trigger to bring the patient out of the trance, and they only realize this quite some time after the young man has been dead and buried. So, what will happen when the grief-stricken, depressed, and frantic wife overhears the whole story and runs off to finally give the proper trigger at her lover's grave? Number 5. The Little Black Bag. Burgess Meredith, who previously acted in no less than 4 episodes of the original Twilight Zone, stars as a former doctor whose career fell apart and is now a homeless drunk wandering the streets. While scrounging through garbage, he and a less bright fellow bum come across a medical bag that it turns out was accidentally sent back in time from the distant future. Being from an era of far more advanced medical technology, the bag can help diagnose a patient's condition and what treatment they need, and it basically works like a mini TARDIS with seemingly infinite supplies inside. A doctor can just reach into the bag and pull out the exact medicine or tool they need like magic, and, once activated, said tools practically do the delicate work all on their own. So even though he's out of practice, not entirely sober, and his hands aren't as steady as they once were, Dr. Meredith is able to treat people with illnesses and injuries that would have otherwise been beyond treatment in the current century. For the first time in years, he feels that special joy of mending what's broken and making a difference that he thought he would never feel again. Sure, the bag and all of its futuristic technology are doing all the real work, but hey, a saved life is a saved life. And he intends to save as many more lives as possible by sharing the bag and all the miraculous things it can do with the whole world, and swiftly bring medical science centuries forward. However, the other bum, who believes the bag is just as much his discovery as it is Meredith's, wants to use the wonders of the bag for his own fame and fortune, and he isn't going to take no for an answer. Burgess Meredith is always a delight, and he effortlessly plays a washed-up, complacent has-been who's still fairly eloquent and charming, and who rediscovers the passion that drove him to become a doctor in the first place. A great leading man in a great little sci-fi parable about what happens whenever an amazing, potentially world-changing discovery is made. One man's genuinely good-willed desire to use it for the benefit of others is almost inevitably met with another man whose greed and savagery threaten to squander all that potential for everyone. Tragically, both are just different sides of human nature. But in the end, another part of human nature is learning from our mistakes. And the more advanced our technology gets in the future, naturally, the more important it is to design said technology with fail-safes, just in case it ever does fall into the wrong hands. Number 4. Hickman's Model. This one is based on the H.P. Lovecraft short story of the same name, which has since gotten another, way more horrifying adaptation in Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities, but this version is still pretty effective for what it is, and one that I've always considered a highlight of the series. The titular Pickman is a famous painter who teaches a general art class, but he's known for darker, more gruesome and disturbing artwork, and that reputation gets him fired, much to the disappointment and intrigue of one of his students, who's taken a liking to the mysterious, reclusive Pickman. This romantic angle wasn't a thing in the original story, but in this retelling it works well to put us in the shoes of a well-meaning, normal person who becomes drawn to this enigmatic creator of such monstrous, off-putting horrors, and she just can't help but explore what really makes such an artist tick. Why does Pickman try so hard to push away his biggest fan, and refuses to ever let anyone into his home to see his originals or witness him actually painting? Why does he wear gloves everywhere he goes? And whatever inspired him to create such vivid, morbid visions of a hideous subterranean species waiting for their time to resurface and drag humanity down to an unspeakable fate? Well, as our curious young lady eventually finds out the hard way when she follows him home, the answers are hauntingly simple. Hickman has just been painting what he sees. Like I said earlier, Night Gallery didn't have a ton of stories with memorable actual monsters in them, but this one does, and it's easily my favorite monster in the series. I also think this segment works as a decent gateway to Lovecraftian eldritch horror, where the real scary part in the end isn't just that there's a monster in some guy's basement, but how that was just a small glimpse of the ancient, unknowable nightmares lurking just below the world we see, and that are always just one wrong open door away from turning everything we think we know about mankind's place in nature upside down. Number 3. Midnight Never Ends. As Rod Serling penned stories go, the mystery going on in this segment is quite possibly the most surreal and genuinely hard to solve on first viewing since Five Characters in Search of an Exit. A woman is driving down the highway at night and picks up a hitchhiking Marine. As they talk, we see they're both experiencing a troubling sense of deja vu, feeling like they've met the very same way before. Somehow they already know each other's names, and sometimes the Marine already knows exactly what the woman is going to say before even she does. At the same time, there's also some mysterious and glaring gaps in their memories, like where they're each from, why they're going where they're going, how long they've been doing their current jobs, and why the woman has a gun that she doesn't remember carrying. And when they come upon a diner, they both have a foreboding feeling that they shouldn't go in, knowing something will happen in there, but not knowing exactly what. and something ultimately compels them to stop and venture in anyway. The whole thing has a very dreamlike feel, with that same strange sense of incompleteness even extending to their surroundings. It's not necessarily obvious at first, but the longer the scenario goes on, the more you notice things like how empty this highway really is, even for nighttime, with just endless pitch blackness except for the occasional sign or little bit of foliage passing by. And when they stop at that familiar diner, the interior has no visible ceiling, and the walls just have the bare minimum trappings you'd expect to see, with nobody noticing the missing details until someone actually thinks to look for them. I love what a moody, puzzling, existential segment this is, and much like Class of '99, while it's intriguing on your first watch, it's arguably even better on a rewatch, when you go in already knowing the answer to the big mystery, and can appreciate all the clues you may not have even noticed before, and other clever little touches all throughout. A creative, compelling, trippy standout of the series, and another that would have fit right in with the best of the original Twilight Zone. Number 2. The Cemetery. This was the first of the three stories that made up Night Gallery's original pilot movie, and most seem to agree it's by far the best of the three and even one of the best of the whole series. Roddy McDowall plays the nephew of a wealthy, wheelchair-bound old man who's recovering from a stroke, and whose will leaves his fortune to McDowall's mother. But when McDowall pays his uncle a visit, he reveals that she's recently passed away, which, much to the old man's chagrin, makes his black sheep nephew now the sole beneficiary. Not wanting him to have a chance to make any last-minute amendments to the will in light of this change, and knowing that his uncle's condition demands that he must be kept away from too much cold air for too long, McDowell kindly gives his dear uncle a comfy seat right next to an open window and plenty of time alone. Yeah, this guy is a real scoundrel.
I am a scoundrel, am I not?
You're a swine.
Sorry, a real swine, not even pretending to be upset or remotely respectful when his uncle is pronounced dead, never missing an opportunity to insult and belittle the butler who loyally served his uncle for years, and using his inheritance just to live on Easy Street, party it up, and see just how much abuse said butler will take from him. His party is soon pooped, however, when he notices that a painting of the cemetery next to the manor is unexplainably changing. Each time he looks at it, he sees, bit by bit, a coffin gradually rising up and its occupant, who chillingly resembles his late uncle, slowly moving toward the house. And he seems to be the only one who notices anything out of the ordinary about the painting. Is he losing his mind and seeing things, or is this really his dead uncle's unique way of haunting him? In any case, he grows more and more paranoid, isolated, and filled with dread as the figure in the painting lumbers closer and closer to the front door. Both McDowell and the audience are on the edge of their seats, anticipating what will become of him if or when there finally comes a knock at the door. Appropriately enough for an anthology with a gallery as its framing device, this first story makes terrific use of the horror potential that paintings can have. It has such a petulant, posh, vindictive lead character, who is nevertheless always so damn charismatic and enjoyable to watch because it's Roddy McDowall. It's such a classic gothic horror premise that you'd think it was adapted straight from an Edgar Allan Poe story, and it has that creeping build-up to not only a great fitting payoff for a protag you love to hate, but also another chilling twist on top of that just when everything seems to have wrapped up. Overall, The Cemetery is fantastic all by itself and a solid, unforgettable way to kick the series off. My personal top 13 favorites are by no means the only good stories this series has to offer, so before we get to number 1, here are a few runner-ups that I also particularly enjoy and would definitely recommend to anyone looking to get into the series.
Cool air. Pamela's voice. The hand of Borges Weems. Room with a view. I'll never leave you, ever. The caterpillar. You can't get help like that anymore. The return of the sorcerer.
Number 1. A Question of Fear. Leslie Nielsen, before he became better known for comedies like Airplane and the Naked Gun movies, stars as a smug, retired colonel who boasts that after all the wars he's seen, all the real-life terrors he's conquered, he's incapable of being frightened by anything, even mocking the ghost stories being told by a man he sees as a cowardly, quote-unquote, lesser man for buying into such nonsense. That man, played by Fritz Weaver, another alumnus of more than one Twilight Zone role, and alongside Burgess Meredith in one of them, challenges Nielsen to put up or shut up, making a $15,000 bet that he can't make it one whole night alone in the supposedly haunted house without being frightened to death. Nielsen takes him up on the challenge, and soon enough he does have one strange, ghostly, and menacing encounter after another, some of which seem pretty damn serious about trapping and killing him. But to his credit, he's not all talk, dealing with each and every one of them without ever cracking. It's kind of a shame that Leslie Nielsen wound up typecast in comedic roles, since, while he certainly does have comedy chops, this segment, as well as that one vignette in the first Creepshow movie, really show how underrated he was at playing villains or anti-heroes. His character here is a cocky, macho prick looking forward to rubbing his sheer badassery in the face of the clearly crippled man he made this bet with, but he's still compelling to follow through a night in a haunted house, as for most of the runtime, he really is impressively cool-headed, perceptive, and ballsy, never succumbing to fright or shock when faced with things that probably would break many other people. But of course, just because ghosts and superstitions don't scare him doesn't mean he doesn't have a breaking point like any of the lesser men he was initially so quick to look down on. Turns out, in a story with plenty of haunted house goodness, the true nail-biting highlight of the story winds up being a dialogue scene, climaxing in a brilliantly set up and executed ending twist that makes me grin ear to ear every time I rewatch. This segment is just so solid, clever, and has a little bit of everything I enjoy from this series. Smart writing, spooky, building mood in a classic horror story setting, ghosts, ghoulies, and ghastliness presented with the modest but delightful effects of the time, a memorable central performance, and a beyond memorable ending quite unlike any other in the series. For all those reasons, and probably even more I could mention, A Question of Fear is my personal number one favorite segment of Night Gallery. Well, those were my top 13 favorite vignettes from the other anthology classic that Rod Serling was involved with, and that less people tend to know about or celebrate, but probably should. It has its weaker stories here and there, elements from its time that arguably don't hold up so well, and there are definitely other creepy anthology shows that I personally think are scarier and more fun overall, some of which I've already dedicated other top 13 videos to. But if you're a fan of the Twilight Zone and wish you had a little bit more of that Serling storytelling magic to enjoy with a spookier edge, I would definitely recommend paying a visit to the Night Gallery. I'm the Adorkable RJ. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and stuff if you are so inclined. And until next time, glory to fankind, and a very happy Halloween to all.